It was a Thursday afternoon at the Stoltzfist Barn Frolic, and I was the 12th woman working in that kitchen alongside 11 others. He stepped through the doorway, showing no rage and never raising his voice, as he never did, and instructed me to take the coffee out to the men. His delivery was just as it always was, collected and distinct, carrying the tone of a statement uttered 100 times before to someone who had complied 100 times before. I refused, uttering a single word without yelling, barely making a sound over the bubbling pot on the stove behind me. In that exact instant, every hand in the kitchen came to a complete halt. One wooden spoon was left resting on the side of a bowl. Martha Yodar ceased her stitching right in the middle of a dishcloth she was hemming. My husband's expression remained entirely unaltered, and that is the image that continues to haunt me. His face had no reason to shift because it required no adjustment. The structure of our world already possessed a predetermined response for a wife who dared to refuse in a public space. The framework had always been prepared, just waiting for such a moment. The ensuing buggy ride home consisted of 14 minutes of a silence so heavy that the sound of the leather reins straining against his gripped fists was entirely audible. Regret washed over me before our horse had even cleared the end of the driveway. That took place in October during our 5th year of marriage, but the true origin was located much earlier, in a moment far less significant and much more hushed. It initially presented itself as patience, disguised itself in the language of Holy Scripture, and for a very long time, felt exactly like love. Let me take you back to that beginning, because this account requires patience to articulate, not due to its complexity, but because of its deliberate, gradual pace. It unfolded over 5 slow years, which is precisely how these dynamics operate, remaining patient until the moment they suddenly are not. If you wish to comprehend how a person who complied every single day for 5 years reached the point of uttering one quiet refusal in a room filled with women, only to regret it before the doorway was behind her, then listen closely. These accounts were never intended to cross the threshold of the home, and every person who listens and connects with this is another voice openly acknowledging what was once restricted to a whisper. If these words happen to find you in the solitary hours of 2 in the morning, I am grateful you stumbled upon them. If you have recognized this same sequence in your own existence, or if you are still trying to determine if one exists, consider reflecting on when you first noticed it. To trace this properly, I must return to the time before our wedding, before the house, before our children arrived, and before the reprimands and the growing quiet turned into the literal walls of my existence. My starting point is an October day on a road, riding in a buggy with a young man I believed I loved simply because he was steady and untroubled, showing no trembling in his hands as he gripped the reins, which made me view him as a haven. I was 17 and he was 19, with the foliage along Miller Road shifting to a deep copper hue, while the horse navigated the path back without requiring guidance. At that stage of my life, it felt reassuring that everything surrounding me possessed a certain direction. We were returning from the Sunday evening singing, and I was filled with joy, the specific kind of unburdened happiness you possess before you learn you must protect it. During that journey back, I made a minor comment, though the exact phrasing escapes me after all this time. I believe I inquired about taking a longer route past the creek, where the branches of the willows droop low enough to graze the top of the carriage, or perhaps I recommended that we choose seats on the opposite side of the room at the next singing to be nearer to the window where the breeze enters. It was a carefree remark, the sort of thing spoken only because you feel secure enough to voice a passing wish. He offered no reply and did not shift his gaze, though his jaw tightened just enough for the muscle to twitch beneath the surface. His hands made a slight adjustment on the reins, mimicking the action of directing a horse to maintain its path, but he was not signaling the animal, he was signaling me. That absence of speech persisted for the entire 20-minute duration of the ride back to my father's driveway. The most prominent sounds filling the space between us were the breathing of the horse, the turning of wheels on hard dirt, and the groaning of the buggy frame. I absorbed those sounds the way a person does when communication abruptly ceases without an obvious explanation. Before we even passed the mailbox, I offered an apology, expressing regret despite having no clear understanding of what I had actually done wrong. He gave a single, slight nod of acknowledgement, his grip on the reins relaxed, and a sense of warmth returned to the space we shared, resembling a lamp being struck back to life. He offered a smile as he assisted me down from the carriage, wished me a good night, and briefly grazed my hand with the touch typical of courting boys showing affection. I stepped inside my father's house feeling an intense sense of relief. That is the precise term for it. Relieved, not joyful. Back then, I failed to grasp the distinction between those two emotional states, though I would come to understand it later. I convinced myself it was merely a temporary mood or a quiet evening from a boy fatigued by a lengthy day of church who simply lacked the energy for conversation. I decided it was trivial, and in a sense, it was nothing more than 20 minutes of quiet in an October carriage. Yet from another perspective, it was the foundational event of my future, serving as the opening lesson and the initial reprimand, even if I lacked the vocabulary to identify it at the time. I remained unaware that expressing a desire out loud, even regarding a choice of path home, carried a penalty, and that the penalty was the withdrawal of warmth. Once I discovered that this warmth could be withheld, it became the prize I would spend the following 5 years desperately trying to secure. 3 weeks following our marriage on a church Sunday, I discovered that the initial lesson contained a second phase. We had gathered at the Miller residence for the meal after the service, and I was in the kitchen with the women, including Anna, who had also wed that autumn, and Lizzie, who had a year of marriage behind her and carried herself with the assurance of someone who had been a wife for a decade. As we cleaned the dishes, someone brought up the sermon, specifically a point made by the bishop regarding household patience. I offered a minor correction to a specific detail, doing so without hostility or elevation of voice, merely introducing a perspective with the carefulness of someone handling an item they aren't certain they have the right to hold. Lizzie's hands never stopped moving through the dishwater. Anna gave a nod, and the flow of conversation simply moved right past my remark like water draining through a strainer. No one paused and no one glared. It seemed entirely insignificant. However, during the buggy ride back to our home, he broke his silence. His tone matched his usual demeanor, remaining balanced and patient, carrying the cadence of an adult clarifying a concept to a child who ought to know better but has not yet figured it out. He informed me that whenever I spoke in the presence of other women, my words represented both of us. He pointed out that the bishop's wife had been present in that kitchen, noting that established wives take heed when a newly-wed woman speaks with too much freedom, passing those observations along to their husbands, who then form specific opinions. He referenced the passage in Ephesians regarding the submission of wives, a verse that had been part of every sermon I had listened to since I was old enough to sit on the women's benches. He assured me he felt no anger, only concern, and asked if I comprehended his point. When I confirmed that I did, he expressed his approval, tracing his hand to mine beneath the heavy wool blanket and holding it for the remainder of the journey. The warmth returned once more, leading me to believe that this process of learning, adapting, and trimming away your distinct edges to fit the mold prepared by the community was simply the definition of marriage. I convinced myself he was acting for my benefit. That comprised the first year, defined by 2 separate reprimands, one delivered through absolute silence and the other through Holy Scripture, both administered patiently and calmly by a man who never had a reason to raise his voice because his authority was never in question. I failed to recognize the larger sequence, seeing only a protective husband, a watchful community driven by love, and a creator who established the cosmic order and requested only my compliance. I did not realize back then that compliance is a far cry from personal choice, and the territory separating those two realities would become the exact enclosure I inhabited for the subsequent 4 years, shrinking around me with every passing season until the moment arrived when I spoke the single word remaining to me in a kitchen full of women. The underlying cadence was already established, and looking back, I can hear the rhythm of reprimand accelerating. During the initial winter of our marriage, his relatives joined us for Sunday dinner, seating 12 of us around the lengthy table crafted by his father as a wedding present, the exact heirloom bestowed upon every firstborn son in their lineage for 3 generations. The kerosene lamp suspended low over the middle cast a massive silhouette of him against the wall at his back. I cannot recall my exact mistake despite trying to remember. Perhaps I provided an answer to a query his mother had intended for him, or maybe I reached for the bread before the men had completed their serving. It was an act so minuscule it lacked defining features, yet his mother's eyes shifted, not toward me, but toward him, in a glance lasting less than a second that I registered the way one notices a rock dropped at their feet. That evening, once the family had departed and the children slept, he sat at our kitchen table to administer a longer, more patient reprimand. He stated that his mother harbored anxieties about me and had pulled him aside privately after eating, adding a phrase that remains etched into my physical memory. He told her he would handle it. The word handled stuck with me, evoking the image of a horse pulling stubborn to the left or a wooden gate that binds in the winter freeze. The bishop arrived for a visit during the spring of our second year, a standard occurrence akin to a farmer inspecting fence lines to identify structural vulnerabilities in new households. His wife accompanied him, and I offered coffee utilizing the tray passed down from my mother's own kitchen, featuring a minor blemish on the handle for which she had apologized when giving it to me. When the bishop inquired about my transition to married life, I provided a completely honest answer, noting that managing the garden was proving more difficult than anticipated, and that I felt the absence of my mother's walking distance company. I refrained from tears and complaints, opting to simply present reality. In response, the bishop's wife cast her gaze downward toward her cup, adopting the posture women use when confronted with words they wish had remained unspoken. Following their departure, my husband maintained total silence through that evening, the subsequent morning, and the next dinner. On the third day, he had me sit down and conveyed with a sense of genuine sorrow, the kind that made me look to offer comfort, that the bishop had detected a deficiency in my spirit. He utilized the term Gelassenheit to describe the yielded posture and surrendered will that an Amish woman is expected to maintain as an internal anchor. He asserted that I was missing this quality and that the bishop had discerned its absence. Sitting across from him, I felt the ground beneath me transform from a solid foundation into shifting sand, because this issue was no longer restricted to an action at the dining table or a comment in the carriage. It was a verdict on my actual being. Apparently, my core identity was fractured in a place that no reprimand could fix. By the arrival of our third year, I had developed the ability to anticipate, observing his jaw the way a cultivator monitors the sky before dropping seed, reading atmospheric changes, stillness, and wind direction prior to their arrival. I catalogued which churchwomen passed accounts back to his mother and which ones averted their gaze. I practiced occupying less physical space, drawing quieter breaths at the table, and restricting my speech to phrases thoroughly vetted in my thoughts beforehand, evaluating each word for weight and edge to ensure nothing would strain his patience or draw community scrutiny. I transformed into my own overseer, executing the corrections in my mind before he could even deliver them. For a brief period, perhaps a few months, the cycle appeared to hit a plateau, leading me to think I had finally adapted to the expected mold. In reality, the cycle had not stopped. I had merely grown quicker at adapting to it, and the system consequently became swifter at identifying new behaviors to correct. During that third year, while expecting, I sat at the midwife's kitchen table with hands resting on my stomach to ask about a strain in my lower back. The moment I started to speak, he supplied the answer in my place. When I attempted to add a single clarifying detail regarding my own physical experience, his hand found my knee beneath the table, delivering a single calculated squeeze that was not painful, but completely precise. I ceased talking immediately, and the midwife kept her eyes on the table surface, continuing her notations as though my voice had never entered the room. During our fourth year, at the roadside stand where I retailed pies and baked goods to English travelers navigating our region on autumn weekends, a visitor offered a compliment on the lattice pattern of my cherry pie, asking for my name. I returned a smile and answered her. That night, he informed me that my behavior had been forward, using that exact term. A woman who offers smiles to outsiders and volunteers her identity unprompted is deemed forward. I did not manage the market stand for the remainder of that season, choosing instead to sit at the kitchen table with soil still trapped beneath my nails, keeping my hands resting in my lap in the folded posture that had become my constant habit, and simply listened. During a quilting gathering that October, the final autumn before my public confrontation, I encountered a woman from an adjacent district. She was older and maintained a quiet demeanor that mirrored my own. We found ourselves alone for a brief window while pinning wash to the line behind the host's house. She kept her gaze fixed away from me as she spoke, noting that she used to track the number of days separating her reprimands, asking if I had observed the intervals shrinking. I offered no response as she secured a bedsheet to the line. She remarked that this pattern serves as proof that the issue never stems from your actual behavior. Rather, the structure requires you to become smaller, and it will persist with corrections until your identity is entirely eroded. She lifted her vacant basket and went back inside, offering smiles to the remaining women as she took her place at the quilting frame. I never had another private conversation with her, but her words echoed within my physical being because her assessment was accurate. The intervals were indeed shrinking. By the 5th year, my tracking ceased, not because the corrections had dissipated, but because the boundaries between them had dissolved entirely. The dynamic no longer possessed any intervals, ceasing to be a flight of stairs with distinct steps where a person could pause and gather strength. Instead, it had become a slick, unbroken decline angling straight down, and I was no longer walking, I was sliding. Each reprimand extracted less from me because there was very little substance remaining to be stripped away, and each period of silence stretched out further because I lacked the words required to shatter it. I had diminished to the point where my physical presence in my own home could be contained entirely within the narrow gap between my seat and the wall. Even so, the structure consistently unearthed new details to correct: a look, a drawn-out breath, the manner in which a plate was offered, or a delay in passing it. The cycle was no longer seeking out errors, it was seeking out me, hunting down whatever remnants of my identity persisted, and discovering less with every passing season. Following my public refusal, the community provided its response. The bishop's wife arrived for a visit on Monday, followed by his mother on Tuesday, and the deacon's wife on Thursday, bringing a meal along with a passage from Titus regarding the duty of elder women to instruct the youth in being compliant to their husbands. Every single one of them sat at my kitchen table, held my hands, and assured me they understood that a marriage functions like a garden, emphasizing that yielding represents an act of devotion rather than a display of weakness. After each departure, I remained seated alone in the kitchen, keeping my hands folded in my lap while awaiting the next arrival. On the subsequent Sunday, I delivered a public apology to my husband, standing before the gathered assembly after the service with a lowered head and an unwavering voice to state that I had harbored hochmut and felt remorse. He offered forgiveness in front of the congregation, resting his hand upon my shoulder while the bishop gave a nod of approval, allowing the pattern to resume with a tighter, accelerated hold, resembling a rope pulling taut once its strength has been tested. This brought another reprimand that November, followed by one in February that blurs completely into the ones surrounding it. The cycle returned prior to my daughter's birthday, followed by an April night I refused to recount, repeating when the new minister arrived for dinner, and continuing without end. Then came an ordinary weeknight in March, completely unremarkable, when he sat our firstborn daughter at the kitchen table to correct her for speaking out of turn at school. He employed the identical tone, the same patience, and the same measured composure, drawing upon the very same scripture passages. Standing at the counter behind them, I watched my daughter fold her hands within her lap, small, motionless hands, arranged in the exact configuration as my own. She was only 6 years old. The following morning brought absolute stillness, as he had departed for the barn prior to dawn, and the children were outside. I could hear their voices echoing near the chicken coop, pitched high and unburdened, characteristic of children before they learn they must modulate their volume. I stood before the kitchen sink, resting my hands within the warm water where the morning dishes were submerged to soak: 3 plates, 3 forks, and a pot containing remnants of oatmeal. The window positioned above the basin looked out onto the backyard, offering a view of the clothesline where that woman from the neighboring district had stood with me and shared her count. No laundry occupied the line that morning. It was merely rope and wooden pins bathed in the thin light of March filtering through the pane and illuminating my submerged hands. I remained frozen there for an extensive duration, losing track of time as the water shifted from warm to cool and finally to cold, yet I stayed motionless. My mind did not dwell on the reprimands, the public apology, the bishop's wife, the verses from Titus, or the 14-minute journeys of absolute silence. I was simply observing my own hands. They were completely still, and it dawned on me gradually, the way winter daylight emerges in slow increments rather than all at once, that I possessed no memory of the last time my hands had been motionless without being folded, without waiting, and without bracing for an impending consequence. My hands were merely resting in the water. The water felt cold, the light appeared sparse, and something within me reached a definitive conclusion. I cannot find a more accurate descriptor. It simply finished. It did not break or snap. It finished, the way a piece of land stops yielding crops after years of continuous cultivation without a fallow period, or the way a timepiece stops once its internal spring has unwound to its absolute limit. It occurred silently and without drama. My physical being had endured the pattern for the exact duration it was capable of sustaining it, and in that kitchen, by that basin of cold water and thin light, accompanied by the distant voices of my children, it relinquished the burden. This did not stem from a conscious choice, but rather from the simple reality that no strength remained to maintain the grip. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel my mother had placed into my hope chest when I turned 16, a white cotton cloth featuring small blue flowers embroidered along the border. I gripped it a moment longer than necessary, draped it over the side of the sink, and exited the kitchen without folding my hands. Years later, after my departure, after enduring an entirely different variety of silence, and after discovering how to speak in spaces where no one monitored my words, a therapist provided a definition for the cycle. I had been describing the sequence of reprimands to her, initiating the account with that carriage ride during our courtship to trace the history from its origin, cataloging them sequentially until I paused mid-sentence upon realizing I was counting them. I had always been engaged in counting. She allowed the quiet to linger before stating that what I was describing is recognized as coercive control, explaining that the reason it consistently accelerated and the intervals between corrections shrank is because the framework is constructed to systematically diminish your independence until compliance becomes absolute. Your obedience did not halt the process. Your obedience served as its fuel. The intensification does not represent a breakdown of the dynamic. It represents the mechanism performing exactly according to its design. Sitting in that office, I felt that definition settle inside me like a key finding its matching lock, perfectly shaped for the reality of coercive control. The descent possessed a title, and that title clarified why the path only ever led downward. He was not transforming into a monster. Rather, the social mechanism was operating flawlessly, and he was executing his role with increasing proficiency each year. The same applied to me, to his mother, to the bishop, to the midwife who looked away, and to every woman who crossed my threshold following the public apology bearing scripture, meals, and expressions of concern. We were all participants in the identical dynamic, with some of us navigating the descent while others maintained the structure of the stairs. The mechanism itself remained indifferent to your specific position. Its sole requirement was your continued presence upon it. If you have found yourself calculating the intervals separating reprimands, your situation is recognized. If the time between these moments is diminishing and you have convinced yourself this indicates a personal failure to achieve goodness, your situation is recognized. If you have adjusted your definition of what constitutes mistreatment so many times that the memory of a normal existence prior to the initial correction has faded, your situation is recognized. If that woman at the clothesline feels familiar because you have occupied a space right beside your own version of her and felt those exact words resonate in your own body, your situation is recognized. If you are engaging with this during the night because the household has finally grown silent, and that silence represents the solitary territory remaining under your control, your situation is recognized. This dynamic is a tangible reality. It possesses a specific name. It does not originate in your imagination. It was never your fault, and it holds no internal mechanism to slow itself down. It was never designed to decelerate on its own, because that is the fundamental nature of the system. If these insights have reached you, consider passing them along to individuals who might need them, not for the sake of visibility, but for the benefit of any woman who is currently calculating the intervals and remains unaware that her experience carries a specific name. Every shared connection acts like a line of shared work, and every response is another voice acknowledging their own count. Consider reflecting on the number of reprimands it required before you ceased accepting the blame for them, or before your hands began to fold automatically without instruction. You possess the right to cease the calculation. You possess the right to remove yourself before the subsequent reprimand takes place, and you possess the right to unfold your hands. I stood before a kitchen basin on a quiet morning in March, and an internal element reached its completion. It did not fracture, it simply finished. I want you to understand that this conclusion was not a final destruction, but rather the initial authentic action my physical being had performed in years, representing my body finally manifesting reality after 5 years of executing an expected version of it. You have the right to let your body manifest reality. You have the right to utter a refusal, even in a quiet voice, even a single time, and even in this very moment.